When captured by Japanese forces, fewer than 3 out of every 5 B-29 airmen lived to see freedom again. Those who survived endured captivity, measured not in months, but in relentless days of torture that pushed human endurance beyond its limits. They faced execution rates surpassing every other Allied prisoner group, and their treatment trampled every international warfare agreement ever written. What befell them transcends what most people can fathom. Now you'll discover why their destiny was sealed the moment they bailed out over Japanese soil. When we picture the air war over Japan, we typically imagine formations of gleaming bombers, striking targets and returning safely to their bases. The reality for hundreds of B-29 crews told an entirely different story. The Boeing B-29 Super Fortress represented the cutting edge of World War II aviation, designed to travel over 3,000 miles while carrying 10 tons of ordnance. Operating from bases in the Mariana Islands starting in late 1944, these enormous aircraft carried 11-man crews on missions stretching up to 16 hours. These bombers were essential because Japan's industrial heart lay in its cities. Striking them offered the only pathway to crippling the enemy war machine without launching a costly invasion of the home islands. Flying from Saipan, Tinian, and Guam, the B-29s could strike anywhere in Japan. But this advantage carried a terrible price. Any crew forced down would land in hostile territory with no chance of rescue. The Japanese grasped what the B-29s meant to the war effort. Every bomb came from these aircraft, and Japanese civilians witnessed the destruction firsthand. By early 1945, American firebombing campaigns were systematically incinerating Japanese cities. The Tokyo firebombing of March 9th to 10th, 1945, claimed more lives in a single night than either atomic bomb would later that year. Over 15 square miles burned to ash, and roughly 100,000 civilians perished in the inferno. Japanese leadership understood these raids were destroying their nation's war capacity, but they also viewed them as terror attacks against defenseless populations. This perception would prove catastrophic for any B-29 crewman captured by Japanese forces. On August 13, 1942, the Japanese government enacted what became known as the Enemy Airmen's Act. This legislation declared that Allied airmen conducting bombing raids on Japanese territory would be treated as violators of international law rather than legitimate prisoners of war. The wording was calculated and explicit. Captured airmen received no Geneva Convention protection and could face prosecution as war criminals for what Japan labeled indiscriminate bombing of civilians. In practice, this meant B-29 crews were marked for death the instant this law took effect. American intelligence was aware of the legislation, but underestimated how ruthlessly it would be enforced. They assumed it might produce show trials and selective executions for propaganda. The truth proved far grimmer. Approximately 570 American airmen were captured between 1944 and 1945 after their aircraft went down over Japan or Japanese-controlled territory. Most were B-29 crew members. Fewer than 60% survived until liberation in August 1945. This 40% death rate vastly exceeded the overall Allied prisoner death rate in Japanese hands, which already reached an appalling 27%. Yet raw statistics mask the harrowing reality of their ordeal. To grasp their fate, you must understand what happened from the moment they touched ground. When a B-29 fell from the sky, crew members who successfully deployed parachutes faced immediate peril even before landing. Historical records document Japanese civilians and soldiers firing at descending airmen. One 460th Bombardment Group crewman was machine-gunned to death mid-descent, his parachute offering zero protection. Those reaching the ground alive often encountered furious civilian mobs. The residents of these areas had just survived bombing raids that obliterated their homes and families. They recognized American flight suits and attacked with whatever weapons lay at hand. Rocks, sticks, farm implements, and crude weapons rained down on captured flyers. Survivors consistently reported being beaten with rocks and struck by iron bars immediately after capture. In numerous instances, civilians killed crew members outright before military or police could intervene. When a B-29 crashed near Tokyo on March 10, 1945, 3 survivors were beaten to death by civilians within minutes of being apprehended. The survivors who lived through initial capture typically faced interrogation at nThe headquarters. The nThe served as Japan's military police, wielding virtually unrestricted authority over prisoners. These men directed the interrogation centers and applied techniques deliberately designed to inflict agony while extracting information. Captured airmen described questioning sessions stretching hours without respite. Guards posed questions repeatedly, and any response deemed inadequate triggered physical retaliation. Bamboo beating formed the primary torture method, with kendo sticks striking heads, backs, and joints. The beatings created massive contusions and frequently fractured bones, yet remained calculated to delay death. Sleep deprivation became routine. Prisoners occupied cramped cells, while guards prevented sleep for consecutive days. Whenever prisoners attempted rest, guards jolted them awake every few minutes. Water torture appeared frequently in survivor accounts. Interrogators forced enormous quantities of liquid down prisoners' throats until their stomachs distended painfully. Then guards would compress the prisoner's abdomen forcefully, expelling the water. This cycle repeated throughout sessions. Electrical torture was administered using varied techniques, some involving telephone generators producing sustained current through the body. Others employed the main electrical grid to energize metal furniture prisoners were bound to. With female prisoners, electrodes were positioned internally. The agony proved unbearable, and anticipating repeated shocks fractured many prisoners psychologically before their bodies gave way. Yet the most crushing aspect of nThe interrogation lay in its pointlessness. Interrogators sought specific military intelligence regarding bombing locations, aircraft specifications, and planned raids. Most B-29 crew members ranked as junior officers or enlisted personnel without access to strategic knowledge. They could discuss only basic details of their own aircraft and crew, information holding no intelligence value, yet beating continued regardless. Prisoners insisting they possessed nothing were accused of deception and tortured savagely. Those fabricating details to halt the pain were beaten for lying. There existed no path to satisfying interrogators because the knowledge they demanded didn't exist at crew level. The nThe maintained a notorious Tokyo facility where prisoners encountered their most extreme suffering. Holding cells occupied spaces measuring roughly 6 feet by 6 feet, formerly used as horse stalls. Multiple prisoners crowded into these minuscule enclosures. They received almost no sustenance, typically just a small rice portion daily. Medical assistance was systematically denied. Wounded men languished without treatment, and injuries became targets for additional abuse. If a prisoner screamed in agony, guards beat not just that man, but everyone in the cell collectively. Hearing tortured comrades shriek during interrogation sessions inflicted profound psychological wounds. The relentless daily routine of torture was devastating. Multiple survivors described the sounds of suffering as worse than experiencing torture directly, because helplessness and inability to aid created unbearable mental torment. Japanese authorities periodically transported prisoners to urban centers for public humiliation and violence. One B-29 bombardier was lashed to posts in a schoolyard where Japanese soldiers conducted bayonet practice on him. The final thrust penetrated his neck and throat. Another crew member stood on display downtown Tokyo for 5 continuous hours while civilians hurled stones, kicked him, and struck him. He lost consciousness repeatedly only to endure further assault. These exhibitions served multiple purposes. They satisfied civilian desires for vengeance while demonstrating to the population that American airmen faced punishment for their attacks on Japanese civilians. Military tribunals convened under the Enemy Airmen's Act, but they were predetermined charades. Proceedings typically lasted under an hour. Prisoners appeared before military courts facing charges of indiscriminate bombing and civilian murder. They had no attorneys, no evidentiary rights, and no appeals. Verdicts were foreordained. 11 airmen faced beheading at a rifle range, executions occurring weeks before Japan's capitulation when leadership recognized the war was lost. Yet killings proceeded regardless. 15 American airmen were beheaded at Fukuoka on August 15, 1945, hours after the Japanese government announced surrender intentions. Execution methods varied, though beheading predominated. sword executions demanded precision and botched attempts occurred frequently. In one documented instance, two B-29 crew members sentenced to death at Osaka military prison endured a failed beheading where the executioner's blade didn't completely sever the head. They were finished with point-blank gunshots. Some prisoners were transported to isolated locations and shot by firing squads. Others died through lethal injection, with prison physicians administering fatal doses while claiming to provide medical treatment. Between March and June 1945 alone, 9 seriously wounded airmen held at Tokyo Kempeitai headquarters were executed by injection, specifically because the Japanese refused to allocate medical resources. At least 132 Allied airmen are documented as executed following summary trials during 1944 and 1945, but this represents only confirmed cases where records survived. The true total certainly exceeds this because Japanese military units systematically destroyed evidence as Allied forces advanced. Prisoner records were incinerated, bodies were exhumed and cremated, and documentation was obliterated. Numerous crew members simply disappeared with no capture records or fate documentation. Their families received only the missing in action designation, never discovering the actual truth. Beyond formal executions, many prisoners perished from starvation and disease. The death rate from illness in Japanese prisoner camps reached catastrophic levels. Captured airmen received minimal rations, typically a small rice bowl providing perhaps 600 calories daily. Men weighing over 200 pounds when captured dwindled to under 120 pounds within months. Illnesses including dysentery, beriberi, and diphtheria spread rapidly amid filthy conditions. Dysentery sufferers received no food and were left to starve. One B-29 crew member contracted diphtheria and became paralyzed throughout his captivity, surviving only because the war concluded before complications killed him. Medical atrocities also occurred. At Kyushu University in Fukuoka, 9 B-29 crew members who survived their May 5, 1945 aircraft crash were transported to the medical school's anatomy division. During the following 3 weeks, they underwent vivisection experiments. These weren't legitimate surgical procedures, they were torture sessions disguised as research. The prisoners received no anesthesia. They remained conscious as body parts were removed for examination. All 9 perished directly from these experiments. The physicians and officers involved were eventually prosecuted and convicted of war crimes, but the anguish these men experienced cannot be adequately described. Throughout the final war months, scattered accounts surfaced of cannibalism involving captured Allied airmen. Japanese soldiers, frequently starving due to fractured supply networks, murdered prisoners and consumed their remains. One Indian prisoner testified during war crimes proceedings that on November 12, 1944, he witnessed Kempeitai officers behead an Allied pilot, then carve flesh from the arms, legs, and buttocks. The meat was carried away and cooked. Another witness described a systematic cycle in New Guinea where Japanese soldiers executed one prisoner each day and consumed the flesh. The precise number of B-29 crew members subjected to this fate remains unknown, but testimony confirms it happened repeatedly across multiple locations. The psychological devastation experienced by survivors proved permanent and immense. Many spent their remaining years unable to articulate their experiences. One bombardier displayed nude in a cage at Tokyo Zoo for public viewing had weighed 215 pounds upon capture. At liberation, he weighed 122 pounds. Physical scars were evident, yet psychological damage penetrated far deeper. Survivors endured nightmares, flashbacks, and inability to process what happened. Many never healed psychologically. The Japanese policy of designating B-29 crews as war criminals rather than prisoners established a framework where torture and execution became standard rather than exceptional. Every captured crew member faced the same destiny, with only timing and methodology varying. When Japan surrendered in August 1945, Allied occupation forces launched comprehensive prisoner treatment investigations. The evidence unearthed proved overwhelming and horrifying. War crimes tribunals convened in Yokohama, where surviving prisoners delivered detailed captivity testimony. Japanese officers and guards were prosecuted and sentenced for orchestrating torture unlawful executions, and biological experiments. For families of deceased prisoners, however, justice could never restore what had been lost. The men who perished in captivity suffered fates violating every civilized warfare principle and human decency standard. Out of approximately 570 captured B-29 crew members, nearly 250 died before liberation. That represents a mortality rate surpassing even the horrific statistics from other Japanese prisoner populations. These men weren't simply war casualties. They were systematic policy victims that branded them criminals and subjected them to treatment shocking even hardened war crimes examiners. The Enemy Airmen's Act established the legal framework, but implementation far exceeded what the legislation specifically authorized. Individual guards, interrogators, and officers inflicted suffering serving no military objective and violating every prisoner treatment accord. The story of captured B-29 crews comprises one of the Pacific War's darkest episodes. These men volunteered for extraordinarily perilous missions. They understood the dangers of mechanical failure, enemy fighters, and anti-aircraft batteries. They couldn't have conceived the horrors awaiting them if forced to parachute over Japan. The systematic torture, fraudulent trials, executions, and surgical atrocities represent cruelty defying comprehension. For families who lost loved ones in Japanese captivity, anguish was compounded by uncertainty. Many crew members remained simply listed as missing, their final moments unknown. War crimes trials eventually revealed the full abuse scope, finally allowing families to learn what transpired. The survivors who returned home carried those experiences throughout their lifetimes. They came back to a nation celebrating victory and moving forward, yet remained imprisoned by memories of their suffering. Some publicly shared their experiences, providing testimony instrumental in convicting war criminals. Others retreated into permanent silence, unable or unwilling to revisit the trauma. All bore scars, physical and psychological, that never fully mended. Surviving when so many perished created persistent survivors' guilt many struggled with for years. Today, captured B-29 crews remain largely unknown outside military history scholarship. World War II narratives emphasize major battles and strategic considerations, leaving minimal space for individual prisoner stories. Yet their account merits remembrance. These men represented the human cost of bombing campaigns and international law's complete dissolution in the Pacific theater. They were ordinary Americans facing extraordinary circumstances against an enemy dispensing no mercy within a system engineered to maximize suffering before death. Subscribe to explore more stories like these.